In the last episode, we discussed early multicellular life and the introduction of active predators. Today, we will explore how active predation influenced an explosion in biodiversity. Active predation was introduced to Primin by the Pteropomorphs. Some of the more carnivorous clades of Pteropomorphs specialized their predatory behavior further. Their ingestion organ grew larger and more calcified, allowing them to masticate larger, tougher foods. On Earth, it is common for organisms that hunt to have eyes that face forwards, allowing them to pursue prey easier. This clade will also see this change. Their body took a more fusiform shape, which made them more streamlined, allowing them to move quicker. This clade is called Monodonta, and it appeared 5.53 billion years ago. Pteromorphs and monodonts can easily hunt any seafloor organisms. One clade of tubustomes adapted a way to defend themselves from them, though. By shifting their bodies from side to side, one clade of tubustomes is able to bury their bodies in the detritus. This clade eventually spent most of their lives under the seafloor. By eating through the detritus, this clade can dig underground tunnels. Expelling waste through its front end worked for tubustomes in the past, but if this clade's waste is expelled in front of it, it would close off its own tunnels. This clade solves this by moving its excretory organ to the posterior end of its body. Like it was with the ancestors of the Pteromorphs, this clade shell became an obstacle for its movement, as its shape makes navigating tunnels difficult. Rather than losing their shells completely, this clade adapted it into an armor that covers its entire body. This comes at the cost of flexibility, which this organism needs in order to dig its tunnels. By dividing its body into 12 segments, this clade can keep its armor and flexibility. This clade reproduces by producing a membranous sac full of gametes. When these gametes are fertilized, they form hundreds of eggs that develop within their home burrows. This clade of worm-like organisms is called vermiforms, and it appeared 5.528 billion years ago. The ancestral diastomes also need to adapt to higher amounts of predation. This clade could protect its soft tissues by tucking its foot into its shell. While this clade may initially detect danger just by feeling disruptions in the current, more effective sensory organs would benefit it greatly. Like the ancestors of tubustomes, this clade has photoreceptive cells on its integument. These photoreceptive cells specialized into 5 compound eyes. These eyes are able to distinguish between red, green, and blue wavelengths of light, giving them color vision very similar to humans. These eyes will be spread evenly around the body. Having eyes caused a need for a more sophisticated nervous system. Blood will also be required to sustain a more complex body. They have blue hemocyanin-based blood that travels through a closed circulatory system. The center of the circulatory system is a heart-like organ that pumps blood through the body. This clade optimized its mobility by developing its foot into 5 tentacle-like arms. With these arms, it can drag itself along the seafloor. By waving all of them at once, it can temporarily swim. When two members of this clade meet, they reproduce by wrapping their arms around each other. When they do this, they exchange gametes. When two of these gametes meet, they form small larvae. These larvae have no shells, but their shells will form as they mature. These organisms are called pentopsids, and they appeared 5.525 billion years ago. One clade of vermiforms was able to use its armor to return to the water column. Branching off of each of this clade segments is a pair of fin-like protrusions. If it finds itself in danger of predators, it can rapidly undulate its body to swim away. This is a type of locomotion called anguilliform swimming, named after how earth eels move. This clade relies on swimming so much that it is no longer able to burrow. This clade has also begun to feed on microbes and aerosomes near the surface waters. Eating such an energy-rich diet allows this clade to grow larger, which prompts the need for a higher oxygen intake. Between each of its segments, this clade developed a pair of gill surfaces that allowed it to collect oxygen from water that is beat over them by the fins. To better be able to escape predators like the monodonts, this clade needed to develop better sensory functions. Depth perception is useful in figuring out how close predators and food are, but this clade has only one eye. While having an eye allows this clade to differentiate colors and objects, one eye is not optimized for depth perception. Rather than develop more eyes, it would be easier for this clade to become smarter. This clade's simple cluster of nerve-like cells became more and more complex, eventually being recognizable as a brain. This clade's brain allowed it to harness monocular cues. Monocular cues allow organisms to understand depth by using pre-existing knowledge of relative size, motion parallax, and contrast differences. This organism grows to a max length of about 10 centimeters, and even though it is smarter than its ancestors, this clade still can't differentiate the colors between its food and polybrachid. This causes them to often accidentally be eaten by polybrachids. This clade combats this by reproducing at a higher pace than they die. This is a strategy called R-type selection. These swimming vermiforms are called polypinids, and they appeared 5.521 billion years ago. As polypinids have to compete with each other to attain food, some may begin to specialize to ensure that they can eat as much as possible. Thrashing caused by the anguilliform swimming may disperse a polypinid's food away from it, so it may develop a more graceful fin-driven swimming. Fin-driven swimming relies on fins moving rather than the body. Since this clade no longer requires as much flexibility in its body to move, some of its segments may begin to fuse in a process called tagmosis. Tagmosis allows segments to fuse and specialize to fulfill different purposes. The first three segments were the first to undergo tagmosis. This clade uses the fins that were on its first two segments to scoop food towards its mouth. The end of these fins are covered in tissues similar to that of their gill surfaces. These tissues act as nets that catch food particles. The fins of the third segment became much smaller, being used only to pass water over the gill surface. After the tagmosis of the first three segments, four pairs of other segments underwent tagmosis. These new tagma each have two pairs of fins. Its last segment never underwent tagmosis. The ability to feed more effectively allowed this organism to grow to over a meter long. This clade's reproductive system changed drastically. For the first time in Primin bees' history, this clade consists of two different sexes. Females produce soft, bright red eggs that hold their gametes. These eggs are 5 to 10 centimeters in diameter and float in the ocean surface. Further advancements in its intelligence makes the males of this clade attracted to the red color of these eggs, correlating orange and red colors with positive things such as food or reproduction. This organism takes a longer time to mature and reproduces much less frequently, opting to care for its young rather than mass producing offspring. When they find eggs, the males of this clade release their gametes through their excretory organ. This more sexually advanced clade of filter feeders is called Filtruvermi, and it appeared 5.519 billion years ago. As Filtruverms die, their bodies fall to the seafloor. Carrion like this accumulates on the seafloor, opening the doors for a niche of scavengers to exist. Carrion like this could be eaten by a specialized clade of vermiforms. Around this clade's mouth are chemoreceptive cells that can detect chemicals that emit from decaying matter. Many dead organisms will still be bound to their protections, like diastome clades with their shells and vermiforms with their armor. On Earth, bloodworms produce proteins that they use with copper found in seafloor sediment to make copper-infused teeth. This clade also uses this terrifying adaptation to gather magnesium from marine sediment, making shiny, gray, magnesium-based teeth. These teeth can be used to crack open the hard parts of dead organisms, allowing them to get to the digestible, softer tissues. This clade is also eligible for tagmosis. Tagmosis of the first three segments gives them a sturdier head that allows them to feed. This clade reproduces similarly to their vermiform ancestors, but this clade lays their membranous sacs within the bodies of carrion. This guarantees newly hatched members of this clade a first meal. These carrion-eating vermiforms are called magnesiodonts for their magnesium teeth. They appeared 5.518 billion years ago. Constant competition with other filter feeders pushed some polypinids lower in the water column. One clade's diet shifted from microscopic photosynthesizers to aurea stipula. Tagmosis on the first two segments allows this clade to adapt its first pair of fins to feeding appendages. These appendages give this clade the ability to masticate aurea stipula stalks. Using fin-driven swimming, this clade can hover around aurea stipula as they feed. But just as competition with filtruverms and polybrachids pushed this clade away from aureosomes, competition with tubustomes pushed it away from aurea stipula. Instead of finding more plant life to feed on, this clade turned to carnivory. Its feeding appendages hardened, which allowed it to break the shell of seafloor organisms. After breaking through its prey's defense, it has access to the more digestible soft tissues. Since the seafloor is where this clade's prey lives, it began using its fins to drag itself along the seafloor. To increase their movement efficiency, their fins became specialized into walking limbs. Tagmosis between the third through seventh segments allowed some of its limbs to keep pushing water over the gill surface, while others can be used for walking. This clade developed a similar tagma on the 8th through 12th segments. The seafloor hunter is called Testoruptus, and it appeared 5.516 billion years ago. One clade of monodonts adapted to hunt vermiforms and magnesiodonts. By developing muscles that help their tooth grind food, this clade could eat through the vermiform's armor. This clade also developed an extended mouth that it could use to dig through vermiform and magnesiodont burrows. Searching the seafloor for its food pressured for its body to flatten, giving it an appearance similar to Earth rays. Since it no longer needs to pursue any prey, this clade's eye moved to the top of its body. That way, it can detect predators coming from above. Its integument also changed to resemble the color and texture of seafloor substrate, giving it camouflage. This flat clade is called Platyventra, and it appeared 5.515 billion years ago. Increased predation from clades such as Testoruptus pressured for pentopsids to be able to find different ways to avoid predators. The ancestral pentopsids were able to swim for short periods by flapping their arms in the water. On Earth, cephalopods can control their buoyancy with the use of a siphuncle. Siphuncles are tubes going through the chambered shells of cephalopods that allow them to move fluids and gases between chambers by using osmosis. One clade of pentopsids developed an organ similar to a siphuncle. With this organ, they can remain buoyant and stay off the seafloor. A curved shell would adjust this clade's center of gravity, making it easier for this clade to control its movement. Polybrachids make an excellent food source for this clade, since they are unable to fight back and make it so that this clade doesn't have to return to the seafloor to feed. These swimming pentopsids are called curvatesta, per their curved shells, and they appeared 5.513 billion years ago. High levels of competition and the presence of predators pressures polybrachids to adapt to a higher mortality rate. Ancestral polybrachids' greatest strength was their numbers, so this clade invested heavier into R-type selection, keeping the clade alive by simply reproducing as much as possible. The gonads of this clade became a set of three sacs that produce massive amounts of gametes. But, along with increased gamete production, comes a need for more energy, which is something that this clade was already having trouble with due to high amounts of competition for food. This selected for a smaller body size that doesn't require as much energy, as well as microscopic setae developing on their arms that help filter microbes from the water. This more advanced polybrachid clade is called Ovibrachida, and it appeared 5.511 billion years ago. Primin fauna is not all that is evolving. After millions of years of Areostipula spreading along the seafloor, it found its way to shallower and shallower water. At this point in time, Primin continental crust is forming a supercontinent. This supercontinent is called Inonis, roughly meaning one island in Greek. Along the coastlines of Inonis, the gravity of Primin moon caused a cycle of high and low tides. Areostipula find their way to these tidal zones, where they are only sometimes submerged in the water. Some Areostipula on the coastlines developed stomata-like organelles in their cells that allow them to regulate gas exchange and water loss. They are single stalks spread into a root-like system that extracts water from the sand and anchors them to Primin beaches. The integument of their stalks began to thicken into a rubbery bark-like material. This helps avoid unnecessary water loss and retain the organism's rigidity. This clade reaches a max size of about 15 centimeters as they do not yet have the adaptations to grow larger. On top of its body, it sprouts a gametangium. Gametangia are structures that act as the reproductive organ for many multicellular flora. On the gametangia of this clade, broad gamete cells are produced and spread by the wind. Sexual reproduction is beneficial because it keeps genetic diversity high and counteracts oxidation of DNA. So if a gamete of this clade happens to land on the gametangium of another member of its species, it will go through with sexual reproduction. However, if a gamete does not find another, it will force itself to sprout asexually. This clade is called Protofolium, and it appeared 5.51 billion years ago. The boom in aquatic biodiversity due to the introduction of active predation and the landfall of protofolia are the most intense biodiversification events Primin has experienced so far. This boom in life may be short-lived, however, as a surprisingly small contender will contest the entire ecosystem before Primin fauna make landfall. If you would like to further explore Primin B, or just talk about its life, join our Discord server in the description below. On our Discord server, you can talk about the Primin universe as well as get looks at future organisms, make art, and get updates on video progress. I would also like to thank and credit the artist who made art for the video. These artists saved me a lot of hassle in making these videos more visually appealing.